it's appreciated. So those of you, one of the things we want to just sort of say at the beginning is that equity is not the same as equality, and but both are important concepts. And so we want to just kind of talk about what they are. And a lot of us, as we talked about doing the teach-in, Dr. Amont sent out this great public health definition. So how do folks in public health look at the terms equity and equality? So here is one way of looking at it. Equality means each individual or group of people is given the exact same resources and opportunities. So everybody gets an apple across the board, no matter what. That's equality. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So some people are going to need that apple chopped up, right? If they're going to be able to eat it. Some people are babies and should not be eating apples yet, right? Like to meet the needs of the people that we're working with, there's going to be some difference, right? So that is equity. And so again, I'm going to say equity one more time. So equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So again, equity is really focused on getting to that equal outcome, not necessarily distributing everything the same. So important to think about those two differences there. And if you want to ask more questions about that, you're welcome to. I can put this definition in the chat box for folks. And Jody's going to talk a little bit about, we're just going to go chronologically, right? We're going to talk about the old stuff first, and we're going to talk about the new stuff second. So Jody's going to talk about archaeology and how scholars who look at monuments in the ancient world have looked at equity and what we can learn about equity through their work.
Thank you, Emily. So I'm kind of all over the place today because I had trouble deciding what would be most interesting to talk about, but I want to say a few things from there was a reading that I provided to the students in my class that focused on like what is meant by terms like monumental. If we describe something as monumental, what do people mean? And then related to that, the question of talking about monumentality more generally. And this is an interesting question just in the last 30 years in anthropology and archaeology. And then it's also an interesting question looking over. So the reading that we looked at in preparation for today talked about how the terms have been used differently. So I would just like to say a couple words about that because we use terms to talk about ancient structures and ancient statues and ancient gateways and and palaces, et cetera, that we are putting onto, we're bringing that to our interpretation. So I just want to give you a little bit of material from that introductory article talking about how we talk about ancient monuments. So basically the author starts out and just says there is no completely satisfactory definition of what do we mean by monumental. People don't agree. And then he points out this fascinating thing. Well, he asks two questions. He says, perhaps monuments are in the eye of the beholder. So he brings in this idea that in order for a monument to be considered monumental, it has to connect somehow with the people, right? Sometimes it's coming from events, the people, there when they set up the monument. Sometimes it's connected to the people making it and what they're hoping to convey. And other times it's connected to what people see in it. And there are threads of all these different things in varying degrees when people talk about monuments. And he points out that the Latin word that the word monument comes from, monere, says it really means to admonish or warn or like to remind people of something. So the word monumental doesn't essentially mean to remember, although we often think when we walk up to a monument, well, it's here to help us remember, right? To help us remember a certain person or event, et cetera. So I want to bring that up. And then I also want to bring up in the last maybe 200 years, as people have talked about this, there's one really significant difference. And this is significant, at least for the discussions of the ancient world, because some people talking about monuments and deciding like, can we call this thing, this statue or this building monumental? They answer the question by asking, is it sacred? So there have been times in the last 200 years where the term was used to say, well, this monument, this statue or edifice or beautiful piece of architecture, this has meaning because of sacred connotations, set apart from other more everyday, or maybe what the word Eliade would use is profane, this distinction. And then other people don't use that at all. They simply talk about monuments needing, they're often have a certain size, they're in certain positions, they're permanent as opposed to temporary. There's a lot of investment, time investment, money, etc. And there's a certain level of complexity. And they look at all these factors and then look for examples of things that they would call monumental. And when I think about examples from the ancient world, I find it interesting that monuments could be threatening. So, for instance, Hatshepsut, who served as a pharaoh, she was a woman, right? And that would not have been the norm. And she is depicted in many monuments as male and as carrying out a lot of the work of any number, what a pharaoh would do. But then 20 years after she dies, they actually take they take her out. Not always the pictures, but I wonder if I can show this to you. I might be able to show this to you if it would be helpful to see a picture. Let me share my, am I going to be allowed to share screen? I'm going to try and see if I have permission to share screen. Nope. Okay, well, I'll just explain it. So there are many times when her, she's there in the picture. But there are sometimes too where her work as a pharaoh is described in hieroglyphics. Okay, so it's like text inscribed and painted on the tomb walls, for instance, or in a palace. They actually took it and scratched off that shortly after she died. Oh, I think I can share my screen now. Let me try. I'll just show you a picture of what I mean. So it's not always you can efface monuments, by scratching text off just as much as you can from, so you see here, the parts that have been removed. And then the other thing that we see, so an inscribed name, just like a statue, represented the essence of the person, their identity, their power, all of this. And you see sometimes in Mesopotamia, which is another ancient Near Eastern culture that we talk a lot about comparatively when we look at biblical archaeology. And this example here, you see that they have taken his face off. This is the king of Assyria, and it's in this beautiful relief in the palace. So part of monumental architecture, and it's this high quality, complex inscriptions and pictures. And they've carved his face out. So you can imagine this is conveying, right, that okay, we recognize you had power, but we want to make sure people walking past this now know that you do not have power anymore. And then I want to hold up one last example of effacement that I think just helps us think about the power. So this is another example of a carved relief in a part of monumental architecture. And in this one, they have not only removed his face, they have removed hands and feet as well. So hand in Hebrew means also power, okay? And of course, feet would help you go where you need to go to exercise power, have influence. So I think there's some interesting things we can learn by asking how are these used? And then why were people threatened by them? And if I were to tie it in for my students, we looked last week at a example of a stele. So, a textual monument, something set up and says, we conquered, right? And this was found in Israel, smashed. So it would be set up, describe the power, and then when the power changed, they would smash the monument. And in the case we looked at, Tel Dan inscription, they just use the pieces to build the wall, right? They're trying to show physically that this no longer has power. So those are a few thoughts that I have as we start in, and then we're going to open it up after Emily shares modern examples for us to just talk about some of the questions students have and observations. So.
Okay, that is so interesting. And yeah, I'm very excited about, I'm going to look at all my museums. I'm going to look for the scratched out stuff more than I have in the past. And I always kind of wondered like what was going on with that. So that was very interesting. So in the last since last summer, we have seen a real interesting what some folks have called a racial awakening across the United States. And with that has come this wave of statue and monument removals. And those removals have come in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's just a conversation about removals, or they've stopped the placement of a statue that might have been placed, but they rethought it. Other places have had kind of a constructive process where they've had a lot of comment and then taken down a monument. Other places have done it silently in the night. Like you wake up one morning and, oh, look, this guy's gone, right? Like this old Confederate general not here anymore. So some people have done, some places have done it that way. Other places we have seen the people arriving in what you could potentially, you could talk about it as vandalism. You could also talk about it as civil disobedience, just taken down a monument or defaced a monument, as Jody sort of explained. Some of those defacing tactics are still happening, right? We've added some things like spray paint and some other things that are contemporary, but the defacing of monuments is still something that we see. And we've seen quite a bit of that throughout the summer as the Black Lives Matter movement has regained a lot of importance in our kind of public discussions. And it's caused a lot of us to start thinking about, what about the spaces that I live in? What about the public spaces? Are they welcoming to everyone? What do they say about our community? Who's included? When we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, who's included, who's not included in these spaces? Whose stories are getting told, right? So a lot of these statues are typically the statues and images of the powerful and the wealthy, right? And if you think about the statues in Walla Walla, a lot of them were not erected based on some sort of democratic process. They were gifts, right? They were gifts that came to us oftentimes from wealthy folks who thought it would be nice to have this item, or sometimes nonprofits that are doing some of this work that are typically also run by folks who have the time and energy, right, the wealth to work on these kinds of projects. So it's there's a lot of class and power built into this process where they are representing their own stories. And we don't typically see a lot of monuments or statues to workers, to the oppressed groups. We typically see, don't see much about them in our monuments and public spaces. So that's interesting to think about, right? Like who gets to decide how that process happens? Has it ever been democratically done? In our community, it really hasn't. So, and that could be true a lot of places, right? So like, what process do we want to use to bring images into our public spaces? And then what should we do with the ones that are there that maybe now we're not as excited about as we once were, or we've, our thinking about them has really changed. And the kind of community that we want to have has really changed and been informed by the anti-racist work that a lot of us have been doing over the summer, right? Everyone I know has read, you saw the bestseller list, right? Everyone has been doing so much reading and work on becoming more anti-racist. And of course, that's going to inform how you look at things, right? So now we all are like, whoa, okay, I see this differently now. So what do we do with some of these monuments, and how should we think about them in a way that promotes equity in particular? So I think the conversation around destruction is really interesting, because the reading that I've been doing suggests that, we can look at taking down monuments is kind of a sad thing, especially when we're pulling them down and destroying them. But what folks who study cultures, ancient cultures and current cultures, see is when we do that, it oftentimes correlates with transformation in the society. Something's happening. It's not just because everybody got real destructive one day and decided to act criminal one day. Something's happening. There's some shift going on, and the desire to change all of that imagery is part of that transformation. So yeah, there's certainly a destructive element to that, but it can also symbolize something greater happening within the society, which I think is really interesting. And for me, the idea of letting go of some of my statues that I'm used to is a price I'm willing to pay for greater anti-racism, right? I can see, like, to me, I'm like, oh, okay, I see how those things might be related. Also, I think it's interesting to think about the theories around what do statues do to us. And there's this whole theory called affect theory that I was reading in one of the things that Jody sent me, which I think is so interesting. A lot of our monuments and statues, and even some of our museums and our churches are designed to make us feel things, right? Sometimes if you've ever been to the Holocaust Museum in DC or other places, you get a feeling, right? There's a very strong feeling that happens when you go to those museums. Other things, if you go to the National Mall, you have a different feeling, right? This openness, even like large expanses of grass that are there, you get a feeling with that. Anybody who's been to some of the great Catholic chapels and basilicas around the world, that's not a mistake, right? That was all done very intentionally to create a feeling. If those of us who can remember back when the Soviet Union existed, they had a lot of statues too, and they were good. They gave you a feeling of fear, right? Like there was a sense of like, and we see in fascist or totalitarian governments, they use monuments as well to create a feeling. So I think it's really important because, that's what the researchers and the academics tell us about the power of monuments. When folks say, who are Native American or people of color, say, I got a bad feeling when I'm, with this statue here, that I think is very legitimate and very supported in what we see in our academic understandings. Statues and monuments are created to do that, to give a feeling. Sometimes they're going to do additional things, but to give a feeling. So there are folks who do this, who are having this conversation and doing work. There's a nonprofit in Philadelphia called a Monument Lab, and I totally encourage folks to go to it. They define monuments as, it's monumentlab.com. They define monuments as a statement of power and presence in public. That's how they are currently working. That's their working definition of monuments. And then they have some additional ways in which they approach monuments. And they're an art and history organization that are trying to help us have conversations about our monuments and public spaces and really critically think about what that does for us and what it could do for us, what we want it to do for us. So that's probably a little too much on current monuments. I would love to hear. Currently in Walla Walla, we're having two big conversations. One about the Marcus Whitman statue that is coming out of Washington, D.C. So the governor just signed yesterday a bill to remove Marcus Whitman from Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. and replace him with a statue of Billy Frank Jr., who's a Native American water activist. And so he's coming back to the Walla Walla area, like this huge statue. So what are we going to do with that, right? That's an interesting conversation. And then another conversation that we're having is we have Christopher Columbus right on the front lawn of our courthouse. So anybody who gets a marriage license or tabs or whatever has to walk by Christopher Columbus. And so we're having a conversation about that. And some students have created a petition to encourage the removal of the statue and to encourage conversation about that particular statue. So I'm going to put a link to that if you want to look at that. And they are doing some work. So this conversation is ongoing. So today I wanted to use the local examples of local monuments to sort of help us have a conversation that is applicable to now, but very much informed by archaeology, history, social sciences. And then if there's anybody who has a statue conversation going on in their hometown that they want to bring in, I'm really eager to hear about that too. And there's that link for you. So comments, questions?
I see Xavier has his hand up. Go for it.
Quick question. Who is Marcus Whitman, the guy who's getting a statue after him?
So Marcus Whitman was a missionary who came with his wife Narcissa to form a outpost and help with the creation of the Oregon Trail and quote unquote settle this land and claim it for white settlers. That's a short version. Anybody want to, Jody, feel free to add what you want to add to that. They had a particular desire to try and Christianize natives, and that's
what I would add.
Yeah, that turns out to be quite problematic. But yeah,
the way that most of us learned the story, like I remember as a child reading that along with countless other biographies, because I was in a house where we did not read fiction, so we read biographies, hundreds of them, and the biographies essentially portrayed this like only as a positive thing. There was no kind of awareness in the biographies that I read as a child of people already being in the land and having reasons for why they live the way they live, right? The assumption was we're coming in and bringing something better and we're serving you and you would do well to like let us tell you what's good for you. And that, I mean, we know now that this is problematic, right? And this is not a singular thing here in Walla Walla Valley. This is a pattern it's happened for hundreds of years all over the whole world. But we have this stellar example right here in our valley.
We can get off into a whole lecture on the Marcus Whitman family. They were ultimately killed, Narcissa and Marcus Whitman, and their deaths led to a tremendous anger, and sort of it was the story that was told about why more white people needed to come and settle the quote unquote unsettled West, and as justification for genocide practices towards Native Americans. So their story and their deaths were used to really fuel some really scary things that, the murder of millions of Native Americans. That story was told over and over again as justification for genocide behaviors, genocide policies that came later.
Okay. Gabriel, I think I saw your hand next.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment on this whole thing about removing monuments and everything. I personally think it's really inspiring to see across the U.S. Such passion to remove monuments that currently don't reflect the society as we know its values of today. A common argument I hear against the removing of monuments is that people are trying to erase history. And to me, that doesn't really make sense because, we have places for that called museums. I feel like monuments definitely hold a different sort of a purpose than that,
That's a fascinating question. How would we compare the function of a monument in a space like out in front of the courthouse compared to what we would expect in a museum, and how are those spaces? Because some of the same questions are being asked about museums. What should be there, and who, you know what I mean? How should it be presented? So that's fascinating.
Cookie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, I find this very interesting because back at home where I'm from American Samoa, monuments and statues are forbidden because of our culture. And it's only because in the past, we tend to have all these myths about, people standing next to the statue and monuments. And when we were colonized by the missionaries, they completely banned it because it was unholy. And so I just found it kind of interesting how Professor Jody was saying that having monuments sometimes mean that, people feel something. I just felt that that was a really nice connection to what my culture believes with monuments and statues.
Is there a sense, Cookie, that those rules that came in about monuments, that kind of produce this message like you either shouldn't do this or you shouldn't feel these things? Like was there that sense, or is there still when people talk about that history?
Well, sorry, could you repeat? I couldn't really hear you. I'm sorry.
Is there a feeling that those rules kind of were shutting down the experiences of people and their
yes.
values or like the feelings that they had, or is it now seen as it just is? I'm just interested in.
Yeah, it definitely shut down the feeling because from what I understand in classes that I took with cultural history from my hometown, when the missionaries came in, Samoans were strictly into monuments and statues. They would worship them and believe that they are the God's bodies cemented, and so what the missionaries had done was completely convert and completely banned monuments and statues from our culture. We still have them today because, like I said, Catholic churches have these monuments and statues, and so do other religions, but with people that are very cultural back home, they completely they don't want to associate with it because it seems like a curse now rather than what it used to be back in the days.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Cater, I think you've had your hand up for a while. Is your hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
So kind of too, but I'll keep it really short. I'm a little confused on the Marcus Whitman statue. So they are removing it and replacing it with a different statue, and they're wanting to put it back in Walla Walla.
Yeah, so one of our representatives, Representative Skylar Rude, made an amendment to the original bill asking for the statue to come back to us. So, I'm not sure if I would have, thought that was the best idea, but in some ways it gives us an opportunity to further the conversation and talk about what we do with this monument. Otherwise, I don't know what the state would have done with it, put it in storage perhaps. Maybe put it in, there is a Washington State History Museum, perhaps place it there. There is already one at the Capitol, which I'm unclear on what will happen to that. But yeah, that was the amendment added by our own representative from the 16th Legislative District.
And sort of part two would be why, like, does anybody know why we felt the need, or she felt the need to, like, did she suggest we place it somewhere? Does she want it, like, I just don't understand why we need to keep the statue.
Well, I think that would be an excellent question to ask Rep. Rude. He believes that the language has been that we're bringing Marcus Whitman home. That has been the language, almost like it's his body, right? Like in a burial, almost in like the way that you bring home someone's body to bury and to be at a place of rest. I don't know. I think it's a very fair question to ask him, and he responds to email. So, feel free. If you are in this area, if you live here and you're living here now as a student, he is your representative, so he should respond to you. Let's see, River, go ahead.
Okay, yes, thank you. So the most interesting take I would say that I've seen on the statue situation is through the process that the Allies, but also Western Germany, employed this too after the Second World War, which was denazification. Now, granted, they were quite hesitant to take down statues arbitrarily. They didn't want to take down statues which were related to things like World War I or to Prussia, because those could quite easily be implicated as being, pro-Nazi sentiments by Western allies who saw, essentially the 2 or 3 centuries worth of, the formation of German militarism as being implicit within the formation of Nazi identification, as being something which should be removed. So in the cases of the Nazi statues they took down, they put up a plaque which celebrated and commemorated both sides, which I would say is arguably the best way to do it. You remember the statue which was there, so it isn't just lost to the annals of history. It isn't just forgotten and disappeared as though it never happened, but you also discuss the implications of it. And arguably that's what cities like New Orleans have done, which have been quite fruitful for that conversation. They take down the statues which were funded by organizations like the White Movement or the KKK or other pro-Confederacy groups after the Civil War, but also put up plaques. So I would say in that regard, we can avoid a lot of the follies of, arguably the Bronze Age and other periods before that, where we just completely destroy statues and we're sort of forced to piece together who that emperor was, who was Cyrus the Great. If we didn't have statues of him, that'd be quite a difficult task to do. So on that front, I would say that would probably be the least abrasive way to go about the statue situation in America, because we don't want to have more abrasiveness. I would say the last 4 years or so has shown that abrasiveness can keep increasing at exponential rates. We don't want that to happen. But more specifically on the idea of sacredness that Professor Washburn discussed earlier on, it's really interesting to see how a lot of the I suppose the archaeology we have of prehistory kind of ties into the idea of a lot of the inherited traditions of, periods like the early Bronze Age or the Neolithic period, where there's a lot of kind of centralization of sacrality within the sovereign. And you have titles like the King of Kings and Emperor and, the Son of Heaven and such titles like that. It's interesting to see how the successive kings or emperors or even political systems after something like a monarchy deal with that question. Some of them are just iconoclastic and completely destroy all remnants of that king. You think of someone like Akhenaten, because he was the heretic who essentially created a henotheistic religion in Egypt. But there's also certain instances like in Rome or Greece where inherited traditions from a monarchy are republicanized. They are oriented towards a different perspective. I always find that just to be an interesting point of inquiry that I like to do personally.
Yeah, River, you bring up a couple things that are, I think, important to notice. One is the connection between like monuments in a way connect forward and back. So in order to be who we are, we understand our history, right? That shapes who we are, but we are also deciding, like, is this what we want to be focusing on, to be, you know, revolving our society around? And then we look forward. And so your reference to that plaque practice made me think about how that's a larger discussion in monumentality, like people who talk about this. Is this forward and back? Your feet are on the ground, but there's some sort of connection. And then you might have noticed in the reading that I sent out that a lot of the examples were from Germany, because so many changes have happened in the last 100 years. And so there's a lot of these questions you can trace even in just Berlin itself, the city. But fascinating. I want to say I saw Michaela next. Michaela, you want to make your comment?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I actually just pulled up the article because I wanted to ask, like, even like your guys' opinion or opinion of other students in this class. I think this summer there was a lot of, monuments being torn down and people like voting to tear them down. And in December, there was a monument in Boston that was torn down, and it was a monument, basically it just showed like Abraham Lincoln and like a slave like kneeling at his feet, and it was supposed to be like representing that like Lincoln freed the slaves, and like I guess maybe the slave was like thankful, and so he was like kneeling down. But then like a lot of people were like, well, that's kind of still depicting this like African American as like an animal and like less than like Abraham Lincoln. So I was just wondering, like, if you guys have any thoughts about that. Like, is it good that they tore it down? Is that one that like maybe they went too far on in tearing that one down? I don't know. I was just curious what you guys think.
Can you put in the or can you like tell us or put in the chat the article or like tell us?
Yeah. Let me see if I can. Well, yeah, I'll add it. Let's see.
To the earlier points about having historical material about historical figures for the future, it's interesting to note that the Christopher Columbus statues that went up all around the United States from about 1890 until about 2020, or I'm sorry, 1920. So they go up, like hundreds of them go up across the country and around the world. There are statues for him everywhere. And there's a huge trend to do that. And a lot of them are very low quality and mass produced. So it's interesting to think about, like, is that what we want to be looking back at? And then Marcus Whitman kind of looks like Davy Crockett. For those of you that haven't seen it, there's a lot of discussion about like, that's probably not what he looked like. Like, we don't like, there's no real sense. In fact, there's one theory that says that the sculptor who made the statue was trying to sell it to Whitman College. And so that he may look a little bit like who the president was of Whitman College at the time, to try to like pander toward that. There's a lot of different discussion about that. So it is interesting, right? Like, how good of a historical record are these statues? It's a question. It's definitely a question.
So
yeah, who wants to go? I don't know, Jody, you go ahead and pick. I'm not sure.
okay, Lauren, let's go with you next.
Can you hear me?
It sounds like your internet.
Can you
might
guys hear
not
me?
be- oh, that was better.
Okay, sorry. So I come from a very politically conservative family. So when all of this was happening last summer, one of my family members was asking me like what I thought about them tearing down statues, and I didn't even know like what was happening at that point in regards. And I was like, oh, are you talking about like pro-Confederate statues? And immediately it was like talking about how it's vandalism and how I shouldn't do that. And I hadn't even stated an opinion yet. So like when you were saying how it creates all these feelings, it just kind of like hit home because it creates such a wide range from different different perspectives. And so I think conversations like this are really important because they're hard to have with certain people. So
Mhm.
Yeah, it's true. It's 100% true. You
Yep.
guys are all very brave for getting into it. I think the students who started the petition are really brave, because there's a lot of pushback, right? And for folks who don't even want to have a conversation about it. Yeah, that's true. I saw in the, Bernice, I know you've been waiting. A couple of you are in the chat box with your hands up. Bernice, do you want to make a comment?
Oh yeah, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. All right, so this is kind of more like an opinion. I think this like conversation is really interesting and I'm really enjoying it, but I feel like taking down some monuments means that like our society is evolving. I mean, there are many people now looking into like what exactly monuments mean and what exactly their place on the landscape and roles they play throughout history. And I mean, if some of these monuments are there that have fought to enslave some of these people and are allowed to stand in a public space, like what exactly would that monument mean in like some of these places? So I really like how our society is evolving in that place where we're able to question some of it and be able to have this discussion.
Great, thank you. It is, it does take some work, right? And you have to kind of be willing to have a hard conversation. And what happens when it's one of my favorite statues, right? Right now we're talking about ones I'm okay with letting go. What happens when it's one that I love, right? Like that might happen, and I might, I got to face that reality. Other folks, I really have no idea. I'm so sorry. I have no idea who's next.
Let's go with Becky.
Great.
Sorry, I don't really know how to use Zoom, so I'm like, where's the mute?
You're good.
But yeah, like you were saying at the beginning, I have seen monuments more as a way of remembering up until the past year, when the significance of monuments have been brought to light, or the significance of certain monuments that should be taken down, or and like hearing what Cookie said about her culture and the lack of monuments there, or the restrictions, like now I'm realizing that monuments are more than just remembering or celebrating, or even if it is celebrating, it's about what society is telling us to value in our history and now. And even with like, I forgot who was talking about the people seeing it as vandalism. I think it was Lauren. Like people could see it as vandalism, but just like with the protests, where some people were like, these people are just rioters who are going off the wall and vandalizing, and there were people who were doing that, but for the most part, it's what you want to see. Like, do you see the value, or where do your values lie? Like, do you see the value in what is happening, and do you value this new era that's trying to rise up? And yeah, and just, it makes me more aware. And like, I think now when I see monuments, instead of it just being like, oh, a statue of this person was significant history, like it's gonna make me think like, oh, what is this area value? What are they about?
Yeah, thank you. Ask what and how. Peter, why don't you go ahead?
I agree with Becky so much of what she just said in regards of like value, and regards of like a monument is more of just a remembrance. I feel like we're in a really cultural shift right now of really educating ourselves and really understanding what each things mean. And I really wanted to talk about the statue in Virginia that was being removed. My sister lives in that town actually. And the day it was being removed, I was actually on a FaceTime call with her, and you could just see the mass amount of people surrounding the statue from both different sides of rioters for it and against it. And I'm completely like for respectful protest. And I think like we're again like in this society and cultural shift of educating yourself. And I feel like I think there was someone who brought up a point of what is a good solution of taking these statues that are not necessarily like relevant in the situation we're in right now, or like in the topics we're bringing up now, like what we should do with them. And I feel like that's a conversation we all need to have instead of just like a one-sided thing. And I feel like more people need to be educated, because I feel like a lot of people are just one-sided on things in regards to these monuments and what we should do with them exactly. But that's just my little 2 cents on it.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. I saw Sarah's hand in, or Sarah said in the chat that she had her hand up. Sarah, you still want to make a comment?
Sure, yeah. Sorry, my Zoom doesn't have an option to raise a hand, so.
Okay.
But yeah, I thought it was really interesting, the point made at the beginning about how a lot of times there's not a democratic process behind how statues and monuments are put up. And I think that's really interesting. I've taken art history this past year, and I think I was just making some connections between the two about how when like pieces of artwork, statues, and sculptures are made, how like learning about it, looking at it can be beautiful, but also learning like the story behind the piece of artwork is what can make a piece of work more beautiful. So I think that's important. I think thinking about like the statues we have and look at is like, it might be pretty to look at, but what's the history behind it that can either make it more beautiful or less beautiful. And I thought that was interesting. Yeah.
Curtis, thank you, Sarah. Curtis, you've had your hand up for a while. You want to make a comment?
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Basically, it's kind of, I guess, answering that whole Abraham Lincoln question. Also kind of talking about how statues have value with people. And basically, from my experience growing up, Abraham Lincoln, I guess, was a hero of mine. And basically, in growing up in the Black community that I was in, he was hailed, for freeing the slaves. And it was about the time I got into high school, learning about Abraham Lincoln and learning how, okay, I guess he really wasn't, like, he really just freed them because they needed more troops for a military necessity, in his words. And then in college, taking US history again and finding out his views on Black people and not really viewing them as equals to a certain extent. It's just, he just freed them because, they was about to lose the war. And so that was more for a morale boost. And basically my feelings for whenever I used to see a statue of Abraham Lincoln or even a picture, I wouldn't say reverence, but I guess to a certain extent it would reverence. But after that, it's it's as if someone I knew, but it's like, yeah, I'm not really cool with you no more. I'm very apathetic towards Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, he played a part in keeping the Union together. But other than that, that's it. He's not really a personal hero of mine, because after learning more about his story, it's like, okay, that's cool, I guess. But yeah, but yeah. And I guess in terms of the whole statue of the slave kind of kneeling towards him, while many people during that time, they were grateful for him for freeing them, it's just obviously everybody's perspective is different. And the way I guess the statue looks, it was like that person is bound towards someone who is idolized as a hero, but wasn't, and with pure intentions, but in actuality, he was just a guy trying to do his best in terms of trying to keep the country at the time together. So.
That's a great point. Thank you, Curtis. And yeah, I think there is some sadness, right? When we start seeing the real, this is why it would be helpful if history books were straight with us from the beginning, right? This is why, to some degree, some of this work needs to be done, right? I do think it sets us up with some false expectations about our history. And then later on, we realize, oh, wait, I want to have a patriotism that's grounded in the truth and not grounded in something that's been whitewashed, right? That's what I want. And I think that's what a lot of us, feel like we deserve a little more honesty, more truth. So, and I think this is how we get it, right? We have these conversations, we hold our community spaces to a higher standard and say, this is, we want to at least talk about this. I was talking with Alarise a little bit, and she says that in the Bahamas, they've had this conversation about, because that's where Christopher Columbus landed. He didn't really come to North America, and he certainly didn't come to the West Coast. And talking about, because they had a Christopher Columbus Day and they have statues too. And I think it's interesting to see, like, some of this work is already done, and we just need to go and pay attention to the places where they've had a lot of conversations, and they have some complexity now. She says that now they call their holiday Heroes Day. And they had a Christopher Columbus holiday, then they called it Explorers Day, and now it's more Heroes Day since about 2013. So we could probably go and find places that are doing some good work here and think about their process and maybe recreate that process. They still have a Christopher Columbus statue. We'll see how much longer they do, but they have made some changes. So anyway, that's a little bit of history about what other folks are up to on the same topic. Jody, do you have a thought about who we should call in next?
I'm just wondering how you plan. I see we have like
we're nearly out of
minute
time
left, and I wondered if you had any tying up things, or if we want to mention again the 3:30 event today. How do we want to tie up?
Yeah, no, good point. I totally lost track of time. Thank you everyone so much for your excellent comments. I found this class to be really interesting and thoughtful. And for those of you who maybe feel like I really don't want to take down any statues, I just encourage you to try to have that conversation with someone. And I hope that you feel like you can disagree in some spaces. And I hope you felt like you could here today too, if you wanted to. There is a great opportunity to see Donald Blake himself speaking. He does not usually speak for the Blake Center Conference, so it's a chance to see the person who the conference is named for, who our center, the Donald Blake Center, is named for, actually speaking about his experience. So I encourage all of you to go to that at 3:30. In my class, of course, you're highly incentivized with some extra credit. So please do that. And that's all I have. Jody, anything from you?
Nope, that's it. I just invite people to join in 3:30 this afternoon. And we will continue these conversations, I think, in my class, at least. I know not everyone got to talk, but I look forward to sort of continuing to think about these things.
Great job, everybody. We can just put you in charge. I think you're ready. You're all good thinkers, good communicators. Great job. I look forward to seeing you all on Tuesday, my class on Tuesday. Have a great weekend.
Do you know if it'll be recorded, the 3:30